Canterville Ghost. By Oscar Wilde. First reading. When Mr. Otis, the American diplomat, bought Canterville Chase, everyone told him he was doing a foolish thing, as there was no doubt at all that the place was haunted. Indeed, Lord Canterville himself had felt it his duty to mention the fact to Mr. Otis when they came to discuss terms. "We have not lived in the place ourselves," said Lord Canterville, "since my poor aunt the Duchess was frightened to death, from which she never really recovered, by two skeleton hands being placed on her shoulders, as she was dressing for dinner. And I feel bound to tell you, Mr. Otis, that the ghost has been seen by several living members of my family, as well as by the priest of the parish, the Reverend Augustus Dampier. After the unfortunate accident to the Duchess, none of our servants would stay with us, and Lady Canterville often got very little sleep at night, in consequence of the mysterious noises that came from the corridor and the library." "My lord," answered the diplomat, "I will take the furniture and the ghost too. I have come from a modern country, where we have everything that money can buy. I reckon that if there was such a thing as a ghost in Europe, we have it at home in a very short time in one of our public museums or on the road as a show." "I fear that the ghost exists," said Lord Canterville, smiling, "though it may have resisted the offers of your agents. It has been well known for 3 centuries, since 1584 in fact, and always makes its appearance before the death of any member of our family." "Well, so does the family doctor for that matter, Lord Canterville. But there is no such thing, sir, as a ghost. And I guess the laws of nature are not going to be suspended for the British aristocracy." "You are certainly very rational in America," answered Lord Canterville, who did not quite understand Mr. Otis's last observation. "And if you don't mind a ghost in the house, it is all right. Only you must remember I warned you." A few weeks after this the purchase was concluded, and at the close of the season the diplomat and his family went down to Canterville Chase. Mrs. Otis, who had been a celebrated New York beauty, was still a very handsome middle-aged woman with fine eyes, and a superb profile. She had a magnificent constitution, and strong nerves. Her eldest son, christened Washington, was a fair-haired, rather handsome young man, who even in London had a reputation as an excellent dancer. Exotic flowers and the titled nobility were his only weaknesses. Otherwise he was extremely sensible. His sister, Miss Virginia Otis, was a little girl of 15, flexible and lovely as a fawn, and with a fine freedom in her large blue eyes.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
First list of phrases. Doing a foolish thing. There was no doubt at all. The place was haunted. To mention the fact. We have not lived in the place ourselves. Frightened to death. She never really recovered. She was dressing for dinner. The ghost has been seen. The unfortunate accident. I reckon. I fear that. It may have resisted the offers. Mr. Otis's last observation. And if you don't mind. I warned you. The purchase was concluded. A fair-haired, handsome young man. He had a reputation as an excellent dancer. His only weaknesses. Otherwise he was extremely sensible. A little girl of 15. As a form.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook. Second reading. She was a wonderful rider. Anne had once raced old Lord Bilton on her pony twice round the park, winning by a length and a half, to the huge delight of the young Duke of Cheshire, who proposed for her on the spot, and was sent back to Eton that very night by his guardians, in floods of tears. After Virginia came the twins, who were delightful boys. As Canterville Chase is 7 miles from the nearest railway station, Mr. Otis had called for a carriage and they started on their drive in high spirits. It was a lovely July evening and the air was delicate with the scent of the pine woods. Now and then they heard a wood pigeon, or saw the gleaming breast of the pheasant, deep in the rustling bushes. Little squirrels peered at them from the beech trees as they went by, and the rabbits gamboled away through the brushwood and over the mossy hills with their white tails in the air. As they entered the avenue of Canterville Chase, however, the sky became suddenly overcast with clouds. A curious stillness seemed to hold the atmosphere. A veritable swarm of crows passed silently over their heads, and before they reached the house, some big drops of rain had fallen. Standing on the steps to receive them was an old woman, neatly dressed in black silk with a white cap and apron. This was Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper, whom Mrs. Otis, at Lady Canterville's earnest request, had agreed to retain. She made them each a low curtsy as they alighted, and said in a charming old-fashioned manner, "I bid you welcome to Canterville Chase." Following her, they passed through the fine Tudor hall into the library, a long low room, panelled in black oak, at the end of which was a large stained glass window. Here they found tea laid out for them, and after removing their coats they sat down and began to look round. Suddenly Mrs. Otis caught sight of a large red stain on the floor just by the fireplace, and quite unconscious of what it really signified, said to Mrs. Umney, "I am afraid something has been spilt there." "Yes, madam," replied the old housekeeper in a low voice. "Blood has been spilt on that spot." "How horrifying," cried Mrs. Otis. "I don't at all approve of blood stains in a sitting room. It must be removed at once." The old woman smiled, and answered in the same low, mysterious voice, "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville, who was murdered on that very spot by her own husband, Sir Simon de Canterville, in 1575. Sir Simon survived her 9 years and disappeared suddenly under very mysterious circumstances. His body has never been discovered, but his guilty spirit still haunts the Chase. The blood stain has been much admired by tourists and others and cannot be removed." "That is all nonsense," cried Washington Otis. "Pinkerton's Champion Stain Remover and Paragon detergent will clean it up in no time," and before the terrified housekeeper could interfere, he had fallen upon his knees and was vigorously rubbing the floor with a small brush and some white powder. In a few moments no trace of the blood stain could be seen. "I knew Pinkerton would do it," he exclaimed triumphantly, as he looked round at his admiring family. But no sooner had he said these words than a terrible flash of lightning lit up the room. A fearful peal of thunder made them all start to their feet, and Mrs. Umney fainted. "What a monstrous climate," said the American diplomat calmly as he lit a long cigarette. Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook. Second list of phrases. She was a wonderful rider. On her pony. Who proposed for her? On the spot. In high spirits. Little squirrels peered at them. The sky became suddenly overcast with clouds. With a white cap and apron. A low curtsy. Charming, old-fashioned manner. Panelled in black oak. Stained glass window. A large red stain on the floor. By the fireplace. Something has been spilt there. It must be removed at once. Mysterious voice. Admired by tourists. he exclaimed triumphantly. Mrs. Umney fainted. Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Third reading. I guess the old country is so overpopulated that they have not enough decent weather for everybody. I have always been of opinion that emigration is the only thing for England. My dear Hiram, cried Mrs. Otis, what can we do with a woman who faints? Charge her for the offence as if she had broken some plates and glasses, answered the diplomat. She won't faint after that. And in a few moments Mrs. Umney had regained consciousness. There was no doubt, however, that she was extremely upset. And she sternly warned Mr. Otis to beware of some trouble coming to the house. I have seen things with my own eyes, sir, she said, that would make anybody's hair stand on end. And many a night I have not closed my eyes in sleep for the awful things that are going on here. Mr. Otis, however, and his wife warmly assured the honest soul that they were not afraid of ghosts. And after invoking the blessings of Providence on her new master and mistress, and making arrangements for an increase of salary, the old housekeeper tottered off to her own room. Chapter 2. The storm raged fiercely all night, but nothing of note occurred. The next morning, however, when they came down to breakfast, they found the terrible stain of blood once again on the floor. I don't think it can be the fault of the Paragon detergent, said Washington, for I have tried it with everything. It must be the ghost. He accordingly rubbed out the stain a second time. But the second morning it appeared again. The third morning also it was there, though the library had been locked up at night by Mr. Otis himself, and the key carried upstairs. The whole family were now quite interested. Mr. Otis began to suspect that he had been too dogmatic in his denial of the existence of ghosts. Mrs. Otis expressed her intention of joining the spiritualists. That night all doubts about the objective existence of ghosts were removed forever. The day had been warm and sunny, and in the cool of the evening the whole family went out to drive. They did not return home till 9 o'clock, when they had a light supper. The conversation in no way turned upon ghosts. So there were not even those primary conditions of receptive expectations, which so often precede the presentation of ghostly phenomena. The subjects discussed were merely such as form the ordinary conversation of cultured Americans, such as the difficulty of obtaining popcorn, buckwheat cakes even in the best English houses, and the sweetness of the New York accent, as compared to London pronunciation. No mention at all was made of the supernatural, nor was Sir Simon de Canterville alluded to in any way. At 11 o'clock the family retired, and by 1:30 all the lights were out. At some time later, Mr. Otis was awakened by a curious noise in the corridor, outside his room. It sounded like the clank of metal, and seemed to be coming nearer every moment. He got up at once, struck a match, and looked at the time. It was exactly 1 o'clock. He was quite calm, and felt his pulse, which was not at all feverish. The strange noise still continued, and with it he heard clearly the sound of footsteps. He put on his slippers, took a small oblong bottle out of his dressing case, and opened the door. Right in front of him he saw, in the wan moonlight, an old man of terrible aspect.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Third list of phrases. The old country is overpopulated. I have always been of opinion that. Mrs. Umney had regained consciousness. Increase of salary. She tottered off to her own room. The storm raged fiercely. Nothing of note occurred. It can be the fault of... Mr. Otis began to suspect that. The supernatural. The family retired. The clank of metal. He struck a match. He was quite calm. He put on his slippers. An old man of terrible aspect.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Fourth reading. His eyes were as red burning coals. Long grey hair fell over his shoulders in knotty curls. His garments, which were of antique cut, were soiled and ragged. And from his wrists and ankles hung heavy and rusty cuffs. "My dear sir," said Mr. Otis, "I really must insist on your oiling those chains. And have brought you for that purpose a small bottle of the Tammany Rising Sun lubricator. It is said to be completely effective upon one application. And there are several testimonials to that effect on the wrapper from some of our celebrities. I shall leave it here for you by the bedroom candles, and will be happy to supply you with more, should you require it." With these words the United States diplomat laid the bottle down on a marble table and closing his door, went to bed. For a moment the Canterville ghost stood quite motionless in natural indignation. Then dashing the bottle violently upon the polished floor, he fled down the corridor, uttering hollow groans, and emitting a ghastly green light. Just, however, as he reached the top of the great oak staircase, a door was flung open, two little figures appeared in white nightshirts, and a large pillow flew past his head. There was evidently no time to be lost. So hastily he vanished through the panelling, and the house became quite quiet once more. On reaching a small secret chamber in the left wing, he leaned up against a moonbeam to recover his breath, and began to try and realize his position. Never, in a brilliant and uninterrupted career of 300 years, had he been so grossly insulted. He thought of the Duchess, whom he had frightened to death as she stood before the glass in her lace and diamonds. Of the 4 housemaids, who had gone into hysterics when he merely grinned at them through the curtains on one of the spare bedrooms of the priest of the parish, whose candle he had blown out as he was coming late one night from the library, ever since suffering from nervous disorders, and of old Madame de Tremolac, who having awoken early one morning, and seen a skeleton seated in an armchair by the fire reading her diary, had been confined to her bed for 6 weeks. On her recovery she was reconciled with the Church, and broken off her connection with that notorious skeptic, Monsieur de Voltaire. He remembered the terrible night when the wicked Lord Canterville was found choking in his dressing-room, with a playing card halfway down his throat. He confessed, just before he died, that he had cheated Charles James Fox out of £50,000 by means of that very card, and swore that the ghost had made him swallow it. All his great achievements came back to him again. From the butler who had shot himself in the pantry, because he had seen a green hand tapping at the window pane, to the beautiful Lady Stutfield, who was always obliged to wear a black velvet band round her throat to hide the mark of 5 fingers burnt upon her white skin, and who drowned herself at last in the fish pond at the end of the King's Walk. With the enthusiastic selfishness of the true artist, he went over his most celebrated performances, and smiled bitterly to himself, as he recalled to mind his last appearance as Red Reuben, or the Strangled Babe, his debut as Gaunt Gibeon, the Bloodsucker of Bexley Moor, and the uproar he had caused one lovely June evening by merely playing bowling with his own bones upon the tennis ground.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook. Fourth list of phrases. Red burning coals. Knotty curls. His garments were soiled and ragged. Rusty cuffs. I really must insist on your oiling those chains. There are several testimonials. Dashing the bottle violently. Uttering hollow groans. A door was flung open. He leaned up against a moonbeam. Grossly insulted. He merely grinned at them. Ever since suffering from nervous disorders. A skeleton seated in an armchair. Confined to her bed for 6 weeks. He had cheated. All his great achievements. Shot himself in the pantry. He went over his most celebrated performances. Playing bowling with his own bones. Red burning coals. Knotty curls. His garments were soiled and ragged. Rusty cuffs. I really must insist on your oiling those chains. There are several testimonials. Dashing the bottle violently. Uttering hollow groans. A door was flung open. He leaned up against a moonbeam. Grossly insulted. He merely grinned at them. Ever since suffering from nervous disorders. A skeleton seated in an armchair. Confined to her bed for 6 weeks. He had cheated. All his great achievements. Shot himself in the pantry. He went over his most celebrated performances. Playing bowling with his own bones. Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Fifth reading. And after all this, some wretched modern Americans were to come and offer him the rising sun lubricator. And throw pillows at his head. It was quite unbearable. Besides, no ghost in history had ever been treated in this manner. Accordingly, he determined to have revenge. And remained till daylight in an attitude of deep thought. Chapter 3. The next morning, when the Otis family met at breakfast, they discussed the ghost at some length. The United States diplomat was naturally a little annoyed to find that his present had not been accepted. I have no wish, he said, to do the ghost any personal injury. And I must say that, considering the length of time he has been in the house, I don't think it is at all polite to throw pillows at him. A very just remark, at which, I am sorry to say, the twins burst into shouts of laughter. On the other hand, he continued, if he really declines to use the rising sun lubricator, we shall have to take his chains from him. It would be quite impossible to sleep with such a noise going on outside the bedrooms. For the rest of the week, however, they were undisturbed. The only thing that excited any attention being the continual renewal of the blood stain on the library floor. This certainly was very strange, as the door was always locked at night by Mr. Otis. And the windows kept closely barred. The chameleon-like color of the stain also excited a good deal of comment. Some mornings, it was a dull, almost Indian, red, then it would be vermilion. Then a rich purple. And once when they came down, they found it a bright emerald green. These kaleidoscopic changes naturally amused the party very much. And bets on the subject were freely made every evening. The only person who did not enter into the joke was little Virginia, who, for some unexplained reason, was always a good deal distressed at the sight of the blood stain, and very nearly cried the morning it was emerald green. The second appearance of the ghost was on Sunday night. Shortly after they had gone to bed, they were suddenly alarmed by a fearful crash in the hall. Rushing downstairs, they found that a large suit of old armor had become detached from its stand and had fallen on the stone floor, while seated in a high-backed chair was the Canterville ghost. rubbing his knees with an expression of acute agony on his face. The twins, having brought their pea-shooters with them, at once discharged 2 pellets on him. With that accuracy of aim, which can only be attained by long and careful practice in a writing lesson. The United States diplomat, with a revolver in his hand, told him to hold up his hands. The ghost started up with a wild shriek of rage, and swept through them like a mist, extinguishing Washington Otis's candle as he passed, and so leaving them all in total darkness. On reaching the top of the staircase, he recovered himself, and determined to give his celebrated demoniacal laugh. This he had on more than one occasion found extremely useful. It was said to have turned Lord Raker's hairs grey in a single night, and had certainly made 3 of Lady Canterville's French tutors leave their posts before their month was up. He accordingly laughed his most horrible laugh, till the old vaulted roof rang and rang again. But hardly had the fearful echo died away when a door opened, and Mrs. Otis came out in a light blue dressing gown. "I am afraid you are far from well," she said, "and have brought you a bottle of Dr. Dobell's tincture. If it is indigestion, you will find it a most excellent remedy."
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Fifth list of phrases. Some wretched. It was quite unbearable. He determined to have revenge. A little annoyed. The twins burst into shouts of laughter. If he really declines to. The second appearance of the ghost. A large suit of old armor. Their pea-shooters. Discharged 2 pellets on him. With that accuracy of aim. If it is indigestion. A most excellent remedy.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
6th reading. The ghost glared at her in fury, and began at once to make preparations for turning himself into a large black dog. An accomplishment for which he was justly renowned, and to which the family doctor always attributed the mental disorder of Lord Canterville's uncle Thomas Horton. The sound of approaching footsteps, however, made him hesitate in his fell purpose, so he contented himself with becoming faintly phosphorescent, and vanished with a deep churchyard groan, just as the twins had come up to him. On reaching his room he entirely broke down, and became a prey to the most violent agitation. The vulgarity of the twins, and the gross materialism of Mrs. Otis, were naturally extremely annoying. But what really upset him most was that he had been unable to wear the armor. He had hoped that even modern Americans would be thrilled by the sight of a ghost in armor, if for no more sensible reason, at least out of respect for their national poet Longfellow, over whose graceful and attractive poetry he himself had whiled away many a boring hour, when the Cantervilles were up in town. Besides, it was his own armor. He had worn it with great success at the Kenilworth tournament, and had been highly complimented on it by no less a person than Queen Elizabeth herself. Yet when he had put it on, he had been completely overpowered by the weight of the huge breastplate and steel helmet, and had fallen heavily on the stone pavement, injuring both his knees severely, and bruising the knuckles of his right hand. For some days after this he was extremely ill, and hardly moved from his room at all, except to keep the bloodstain in good condition. However, by taking great care of himself he recovered, and resolved to make a third attempt to frighten the United States diplomat and his family. He selected Friday, August 13th for his appearance, and spent most of that day in looking over his wardrobe, ultimately deciding in favor of a large hat with a red feather, a sheet and a rusty dagger. Towards evening a violent storm of rain came on, and the wind was so high that all the windows and doors in the old house shook and rattled. In fact, it was just such weather as he loved. His plan of action was this. He was to make his way quietly to Washington Otis's room, talk gibberish at him from the foot of the bed, and stab himself 3 times in the throat to the sound of low music. He bore Washington a special grudge, being quite aware that it was he who was in the habit of removing the famous Canterville blood stain by means of Pinkerton's Paragon detergent. Having terrified the reckless youth to death, he was then to proceed to the room occupied by the United States diplomat and his wife, and there to place a frosty hand on Mrs. Otis's forehead, while he hissed into her trembling husband's ear the awful secrets of the mortuary. With regard to little Virginia, he had not quite made up his mind. She had never insulted him in any way, and was pretty and gentle. A few hollow groans from the wardrobe, he thought, would be more than sufficient. Or, if that failed to wake her, he might scrabble at the coverlet with trembling fingers. As for the twins, he was quite determined to teach them a lesson. The first thing to be done was, of course, to sit upon their chests, so as to produce the stifling sensation of nightmare. Then, as their beds were quite close to each other, to stand between them in the form of a green, icy cold corpse, till they became paralyzed with fear, and finally to crawl round the room with white, bleached bones and one rolling eyeball, in the character of Dumb Daniel, or the suicide's skeleton. A role in which he had on more than one occasion produced a great effect, and which he considered quite equal to his famous part of Martin the Maniac, or the Masked Mystery.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Sixth list of phrases. In fury. He was justly renowned. To hesitate. So he contented himself? Became a prey to the most violent agitation. He had been completely overpowered by the weight. Bruising the knuckles of his right hand. A third attempt. A sheet and a rusty dagger. Talk gibberish at him. Stab himself 3 times in the throat. The reckless youth. Frosty hand. He hissed into her trembling husband's ear. She had never insulted him. More than sufficient. To teach them a lesson. To crawl round the room. In the character of Dumb Daniel.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Seventh reading. At 10:30, he heard the family going to bed. For some time, he was disturbed by wild shrieks of laughter from the twins, who with the light-hearted gaiety of schoolboys, were evidently amusing themselves before they retired to rest. But at 11:15 all was still, and, as midnight sounded, he ventured out. The owl beat against the window panes. The raven croaked from the old yew tree. And the wind wandered moaning round the house like a lost soul. But the Otis family slept unconscious of their destiny. And high above the rain and storm he could hear the steady snoring of the diplomat. He stepped sneakily out of the paneling with an evil smile on his cruel, wrinkled mouth. And the moon hid her face in a cloud as he stole past the great window, where his own arms and those of his murdered wife were blazoned in azure and gold. On and on he glided like an evil shadow, the very darkness seeming to shudder as he passed. Once he thought he heard something call, and stopped, but it was only the barking of a dog from the Red Farm. And he went on muttering strange 16th-century curses and brandishing the rusty dagger in the midnight air. Finally he reached the corner of the passage that led to unfortunate Washington's room. For a moment he paused there, the wind blowing his long grey locks about his head and twisting into grotesque and fantastic folds the nameless horror of the dead man's covering. Then the clock struck the quarter, and he felt the time was come. He chuckled to himself and turned the corner. But no sooner had he done so than, with a piteous wail of terror, he fell back and hid his blanched face in his long, bony hands. Right in front of him was standing a horrible phantom, motionless and monstrous as a madman's dream. Its head was bald and shimmering, its face round and fat and white, and gruesome laughter seemed to have distorted its features into an eternal grin. From the eyes streamed rays of scarlet light. The mouth was a wide well of fire, and a dreadful garment like to his own, swathed with its silent snows the Titan form. On its breast was a placard with strange writing in antique characters. Some list of shame it seemed, some record of wild sins, some awful calendar of crime, and in its right hand it brandished a sword of gleaming steel. Never having seen a ghost before, he naturally was terribly frightened. And after a second hasty glance at the awful phantom, he fled back to his room, tripping up on his long bedsheet as he sped down the corridor, and finally dropping the rusty dagger into the diplomat's hunter's boots, where it was found in the morning by the butler. Once in the privacy of his own apartment, he flung himself down on a small camp bed and hid his face under the clothes. After a time, however, the brave old Canterville spirit pulled himself together, and he determined to go and speak to the other ghost as soon as it was daylight. Accordingly, just as the dawn was touching the hills with silver, he returned towards the spot where he had first laid eyes on the dreadful phantom, feeling that after all 2 ghosts were better than 1, and that by the aid of his new friend he might safely cope with the twins. When he got to the spot, however, he saw something terrible. Something had evidently happened to the ghost, for the light had entirely faded from its hollow eyes, the gleaming sword had fallen from its hand, and it was leaning up against the wall in a tense and uncomfortable position. He rushed forward and seized it in his arms, when to his horror, the head slipped off and rolled on the flue. The body assumed a recumbent posture, and he found himself holding a white bed curtain with a broomstick, a kitchen chopper, and a hollow turnip lying at his feet.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Seventh list of phrases. Light-hearted gaiety of schoolboys. They were evidently amusing themselves. As midnight sounded, their destiny. Snoring. He stepped sneakily out. Wrinkled mouth. He glided. The barking of a dog. 16th-century curses. He chuckled to himself. Eternal grin. Record of wild sins. White bed curtain. Broomstick. A hollow turnip.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
8th reading. Unable to understand this curious transformation, he grabbed the placard with feverish haste. And there, in the grey morning light, he read these fearful words. Only true and originale spook. Beware of imitations. All others are fake. The whole thing flashed across him. He had been tricked. The old Canterville look came into his eyes. He ground his toothless gums together, and, raising his withered hands high above his head, swore according to the picturesque phraseology of the antique school that, when Chanticleer had sounded twice his call, deeds of blood would happen. and murder walk abroad with silent feet. Hardly had he finished this awful oath, when a cock crew from the red-tiled roof of a distant farm. He laughed a long, low, bitter laugh, and waited. Hour after hour he waited. But the cock, for some strange reason, did not crow again. Finally, at 7:30 the arrival of the housemaids made him give up his fearful watch. And he stalked back to his room, thinking of his vain oath and baffled plan. There he consulted several books of ancient chivalry, of which he was especially fond, and found that on every occasion on which this oath had been used Chanticleer had always crowed a second time. "To hell with the wicked bird," he muttered. "In the past I would have run him through with my spear, and made him cry out in fear of death." He then retired to a comfortable lead coffin, and stayed there till evening. Chapter 4. The next day the ghost was very weak and tired. The terrible excitement of the last 4 weeks was beginning to have its effect. His nerves were completely exhausted. For 5 days he kept his room, and at last made up his mind to give up the point of the blood stain on the library floor. If the Otis family did not want it, they clearly did not deserve it. They were evidently people on a low, material plane of existence, and quite incapable of appreciating the symbolic value of sensuous phenomena. The question of apparitions and the development of astral bodies was of course quite a different matter, and really not under his control. It was his solemn duty to appear in the corridor once a week, and to gibber from the large stained glass window on the first and third Wednesdays in every month. And he did not see how he could honorably escape from his obligations. It is quite true that his life had been very evil, but upon the other hand he was most conscientious in all things connected with the supernatural. For the next 3 Saturdays accordingly, he traversed the corridor as usual between midnight and 3 o'clock, taking every possible precaution against being either heard or seen. He removed his boots, trod as lightly as possible on the old worm-eaten boards, wore a large black velvet cloak, and was careful to use the rising sun lubricator for oiling his chains. I have to admit that it was very difficult for him to adopt this mode of protection. However, one night, while the family were at dinner, he slipped into Mr. Otis's bedroom and took the bottle. He felt a little humiliated at first, but afterwards was sensible enough to see that there was a great deal to be said for the invention, and to a certain degree it served his purpose.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Eighth list of phrases. This curious transformation. Beware of imitations. He had been tricked. He ground his toothless gums. This awful oath. A cock crew. His fearful watch. Baffled plan. Ancient chivalry, of which he was especially fond. A comfortable lead coffin. The terrible excitement. His nerves were completely exhausted. They clearly did not deserve it. His solemn duty. He was most conscientious. A large black velvet cloak. He felt a little humiliated at first.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Ninth reading. Still, in spite of everything, he was not left unmolested. Strings were continually being stretched across the corridor, over which he tripped in the dark. And on one occasion, while dressed for the part of Black Isaac, or the huntsman of Hogley Woods, he had a severe fall by treading on a butterslide, which the twins had constructed from the entrance of the tapestry chamber to the top of the oak staircase. This last insult so enraged him that he resolved to make one final effort to assert his dignity and social position, and determined to visit the naughty young boys the next night in his celebrated character of Reckless Rupert, or the Headless Earl. He had not appeared in this disguise for more than 70 years. In fact, not since he had so frightened pretty Lady Barbara Modish by means of it, that she suddenly broke off her engagement with the present Lord Canterville's grandfather, and ran away with handsome Jack Castletown, declaring that nothing in the world would persuade her to marry into a family that allowed such a horrible phantom to walk up and down the terrace at twilight. Poor Jack was afterwards shot in a duel by Lord Canterville, and Lady Barbara died of a broken heart before the year was out. So in every way, it had been a great success. It was, however, an extremely difficult make-up, if I may use such a theatrical expression, in connection with one of the greatest mysteries of the supernatural. It took him fully 3 hours to complete his preparations. At last everything was ready, and he was very pleased with his appearance. The big leather riding boots that went with the dress were just a little too large for him, and he could only find one of the 2 horse pistols. But on the whole, he was quite satisfied. At 1:15 he glided out of the panelling and crept down the corridor. On reaching the room occupied by the twins, which I should mention was called the Blue Bed Chamber, because of the color of its hangings, he found the door just ajar. Wishing to make an effective entrance, he flung it wide open, when a heavy jug of water fell right down on him, wetting him to the skin, and just missing his left shoulder by a couple of inches. At the same moment he heard suppressed laughter coming from the huge bed. The shock to his nervous system was so great that he fled back to his room as fast as he could go. And the next day he was laid up with a severe cold. The only thing that consoled him in the whole affair was the fact that he had not brought his head with him. For had he done so, the consequences might have been very serious. He now gave up all hope of ever frightening this rude American family, and contented himself, as a rule, with creeping about the passages in slippers, with a thick red muffler round his throat for fear of draughts, and a small crossbow, in case he should be attacked by the twins. The final blow he received occurred on the 19th of September. He had gone downstairs to the great entrance hall, feeling sure that there he would be quite unmolested, and was amusing himself by making scornful remarks about the large photographs of the United States diplomat and his wife, which had now taken the place of the Canterville family pictures. He was simply but neatly dressed in a long shroud, spotted with churchyard mould, had tied up his jaw with a strip of yellow linen, and carried a small lantern and a gravedigger's spade. In fact, he was dressed for the character of Jonas the Graveless, or the corpse snatcher of Chertsey Barn, one of his most remarkable roles, and one which the Cantervilles had every reason to remember, as it was the real origin of their quarrel with their neighbour Lord Rufford. It was about 2:15 in the morning, and no one was stirring. As he was strolling towards the library, however, to see if there were any traces left of the blood stain, suddenly there leaped out from a dark corner 2 figures, who waved their arms wildly above their heads, and cried "Boo" in his ear.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Ninth list of phrases. Strings were continually being stretched across the corridor. He had a severe fall on a butterslide. Enraged him. To assert his dignity. The naughty young boys. In this disguise, she suddenly broke off her engagement. Nothing in the world would persuade her. He was very pleased with his appearance. Leather riding boots. He was quite satisfied. He found the door just ajar. A heavy jug of water. He heard suppressed laughter. Scornful remarks. He was simply but neatly dressed. He had tied up his jaw. The gravedigger's spade. Their quarrel.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Tenth reading. Seized with a panic, which, under the circumstances, was only natural, he rushed for the staircase, but found Washington Otis waiting for him there with the big garden sprinkler. And being thus surrounded by his enemies on every side, he vanished into the great iron stove, which fortunately for him, was not lit, and had to make his way out through the stovepipes and chimneys, arriving at his own room in a terrible state of dirt, disorder and despair. After this he was not seen again on any nocturnal expedition. The twins lay in wait for him on several occasions, and scattered the passages with nutshells every night, to the great annoyance of their parents and the servants. But all this was in vain. It was quite evident that his feelings were so wounded that he would not appear. Mr. Otis consequently resumed his great work on the history of the Democratic Party, on which he had been toiling for some years. Mrs. Otis organized a wonderful picnic, which amazed the whole county. The boys played poker and other American national games, and Virginia rode about the lanes on her pony, accompanied by the young Duke of Cheshire, who had come to spend the last week of his holidays at Canterville Chase. It was believed that the ghost had moved to another place, and in fact Mr. Otis wrote a letter to Lord Canterville, who in reply expressed his great pleasure at the news, and sent his best congratulations to the diplomat's wife. The Otises, however, were deceived, for the ghost was still in the house, and though now almost an invalid, was by no means ready to let matters rest, particularly as he heard that among the guests was the young Duke of Cheshire, whose granduncle Lord Francis Stilton had once bet 100 guineas with Colonel Carberry that he would play dice with the Canterville ghost, and was found the next morning lying on the floor of the card-room in such a helpless paralytic state that though he lived on to a great age, he was never able to say anything again but double sixes. The story was well known at the time, though, of course, out of respect for the feelings of the two noble families, every attempt was made to hush it up. The ghost then was naturally very keen to show that he had not lost his influence over the Stiltons, with whom indeed he was distantly connected, his own first cousin having been married to the Sieur de Buccleuch, from whom, as everyone knows, the Dukes of Cheshire are lineally descended. Accordingly he made arrangements for appearing to Virginia's little lover in his celebrated impersonation of the vampire monk, or the bloodless Benedictine. A performance so horrible that when old Lady Startup saw it, which she did on one fatal New Year's Eve in the year 1764, she went off into the most piercing shrieks, which culminated in a violent stroke, and died in 3 days after disinheriting the Cantervilles, who were her nearest relations, and leaving all her money to her London pharmacist. At the last moment, however, his terror of the twins prevented him leaving his room, and the little Duke slept in peace in the royal bedchamber and dreamed of Virginia. Chapter 5. A few days after this, Virginia and her curly-haired cavalier went out riding on Brockley Meadows, where she tore her riding dress so badly in getting through a hedge that on their return home, she went up by the back staircase so as not to be seen. As she was running past the tapestry chamber, the door of which happened to be open, she fancied she saw someone inside, and thinking it was her mother's maid, who sometimes used to bring her work there, looked in to ask her to mend her riding dress. To her surprise, however, it was the Canterville ghost himself. He was sitting by the window, watching the gold of the yellowing trees fly through the air, and the red leaves dancing madly down the long avenue. His head was leaning on his hand, and his whole outlook was one of extreme depression. Indeed, so forlorn did he look that little Virginia, whose first idea had been to run away and lock herself in her room, was filled with pity and determined to try and comfort him.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Tenth list of phrases. The Great Iron Stove. Nocturnal expedition. Scattered the passages with nutshells. His feelings were so wounded. They were deceived. To hush it up. He was very keen to show that he was distantly connected, which culminated in a violent stroke. Disinheriting them. Curly-haired cavalier. She fancied she saw someone inside. His head was leaning on his hand. So forlorn did he look. Was filled with pity.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook. Eleventh reading. So light were her steps, and so deep his melancholy, that he was not aware of her presence till she spoke to him. I am so sorry for you, she said. But my brothers are going back to Eton tomorrow, and then if you behave yourself no one will annoy you. It is absurd asking me to behave myself, he answered, looking round in astonishment at the pretty little girl who had ventured to address him. Quite absurd. I must rattle my chains, and groan through keyholes, and walk about at night. If that is what you mean. It is my only reason for existing. It is no reason at all for existing. And you know you have been very wicked. Mrs. Umney told us, the first day we arrived here, that you had killed your wife. Well, I quite admit it, said the ghost irritably, but it was a family matter, and concerned no one else. It is very wrong to kill anyone, said Virginia, who at times had a sweet Puritan seriousness, inherited from some old New England ancestor. Oh, I hate the cheap severity of abstract ethics. My wife was plain, never had my ruffs properly starched, and knew nothing about cooking. Why, there was a buck I had shot in Hogeley Woods. And do you know how she had it sent to table? However, it is no matter now, for it is all over, and I don't think it was very nice of her brothers to starve me to death. Though I did kill her. Starve you to death? Oh, Mr. Ghost. I mean Sir Simon. Are you hungry? I have a sandwich in my case. Would you like it? No, thank you. I never eat anything now. But it is very kind of you, and you are much nicer than the rest of your horrid, rude, vulgar, dishonest family. Stop, cried Virginia, stamping her foot. It is you who are rude, and horrid, and vulgar. And as for dishonesty, you know you stole the paints out of my box to try and furbish up that ridiculous blood stain in the library. First you took all my reds, including the vermilion, and I couldn't do any more sunsets. Then you took the emerald green and the chrome yellow. And finally I had nothing left but indigo and Chinese white, and could only do moonlight scenes, which are always depressing to look at, and not at all easy to paint. I never told on you, though I was very much annoyed. And it was most ridiculous, the whole thing. For who ever heard of emerald green blood? Well, really, said the ghost, rather timidly, what was I to do? It is a very difficult thing to get real blood nowadays. And as your brother began it all with his Paragon detergent, I certainly saw no reason why I should not have your paints. As for colour, that is always a matter of taste. The Cantervilles have blue blood, for instance. The very bluest in England, but I know you Americans don't care for things of this kind. You know nothing about it, and the best thing you can do is to emigrate and improve your mind. My father will be only too happy to give you a free travel. And though there is a heavy duty on spirits of every kind, there will be no difficulty about the custom house, as the officers are all Democrats. Once in New York, you are sure to be a great success. I know lots of people there who would give $100,000 to have a grandfather. And much more than that to have a family ghost. I don't think I should like America. I suppose because we have no ruins and no curiosities, said Virginia, mockingly. No ruins, no curiosities, answered the ghost. You have your navy and your bad manners. Good evening. I will go and ask Papa to get the twins an extra week's holiday. Please don't go, Miss Virginia, he cried. I am so lonely and so unhappy. And I really don't know what to do. I want to go to sleep and I cannot. That's quite absurd. You have merely to go to bed and blow out the candle. It is very difficult sometimes to keep awake. Especially at church. But there is no difficulty at all about sleeping. Why, even babies know how to do that. And they are not very clever. Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook. Eleventh list of phrases. If you behave yourself. In astonishment. Ancestor. The cheap severity. My wife was plain. There was a buck. To starve someone to death. Rude, vulgar, dishonest. Stamping her foot. Rather timidly. There is a heavy duty on. We have no ruins and no curiosities. Mockingly. Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Twelfth reading. I have not slept for 300 years. He said sadly. And Virginia's beautiful blue eyes opened in wonder. For 300 years I have not slept. And I am so tired. Virginia grew quite serious. And her little lips trembled like rose petals. She came towards him. And kneeling down at his side looked up into his old withered face. Poor, poor ghost. She murmured. Have you no place where you can sleep? Far away beyond the pine woods. He answered in a low, dreamy voice, there is a little garden. There the grass grows long and deep. There are the great white stars of the hemlock flower, there the nightingale sings all night long. All night long he sings. And the cold crystal moon looks down. And the yew tree spreads out its giant arms over the sleepers. Virginia's eyes grew dim with tears. And she hid her face in her hands. You mean the garden of death? She whispered. Yes, death. Death must be so beautiful. To lie in the soft brown earth with the grasses waving above one's head. And listen to silence. To have no yesterday and no tomorrow. To forget time, to forget life, to be at peace. You can help me. You can open for me the portals of death's house. For love is always with you, and love is stronger than death is. Virginia trembled. A cold shudder ran through her. And for a few moments there was silence. She felt as if she was in a terrible dream. Then the ghost spoke again. And his voice sounded like the sighing of the wind. Have you ever read the old prophecy on the library window? Oh, often. Cried the little girl looking up. I know it quite well. It is painted in curious black letters and is difficult to read. There are only 6 lines. When a golden girl can win. Prayer from out the lips of sin. When the barren almond bears. And a little child gives away its tears. Then shall all the house be still. And peace come to Canterville. But I don't know what they mean. They mean, he said sadly, that you must weep with me for my sins, because I have no tears. And pray with me for my soul, because I have no faith. And then if you have always been sweet and good, and gentle, the angel of death will have mercy on me. You will see fearful shapes in darkness. And wicked voices will whisper in your ear, but they will not harm you. For against the purity of a little child the powers of hell cannot prevail." Virginia made no answer. And the ghost wrung his hands in wild despair, as he looked down at her bowed golden head. Suddenly, she stood up very pale, and with a strange light in her eyes. "I am not afraid," she said firmly. "And I will ask the angel to have mercy on you." He rose from his seat with a faint cry of joy, and taking her hand bent over it with old-fashioned grace, and kissed it. His fingers were as cold as ice, and his lips burned like fire. But Virginia did not waver, as he led her across the dusky room. On the faded green tapestry were embroidered little hunters. They blew their horns and with their tiny hands waved to her to go back. "Go back, little Virginia!" they cried, "go back!" But the ghost clutched her hand more tightly, and she shut her eyes against them. Horrible animals with lizard tails and goggle eyes blinked at her from the chimney-piece and murmured, "Beware! Little Virginia, beware! We may never see you again." But the ghost glided on more swiftly and Virginia did not listen. When they reached the end of the room he stopped, and muttered some words she could not understand. She opened her eyes, and saw the wall slowly fading away like a mist, and a great black cavern in front of her. A bitter cold wind swept round them, and she felt something pulling at her dress. "Quick, quick!" cried the ghost, "or it will be too late." And in a moment the paneling had closed behind them, and the tapestry chamber was empty.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook.
Twelfth list of phrases. Virginia grew quite serious, like rose petals. His old withered face. She murmured, "The sighing of the wind, that you must weep with me for my sins." Very pale, she said firmly, "To have mercy on you." Across the dusky room, the faded green tapestry, embroidered, horrible animals with lizard tails, a great black cavern.
Please, do the exercises of this reading lesson in the textbook. Thirteenth reading. Chapter 6. About 10 minutes later the bell rang for tea. And as Virginia did not come down, Mrs. Otis sent up one of the servants to tell her. After a little time he returned and said that he could not find Miss Virginia anywhere. As she was in the habit of going out to the garden every evening to get flowers for the dinner table, Mrs. Otis was not at all alarmed at first, but when 6 o'clock struck, and Virginia did not appear, she became really agitated, and sent the boys out to look for her, while she herself and Mr. Otis searched every room in the house. At 6:30 the boys came back and said that they could find no trace of their sister anywhere. They were all now in the greatest state of excitement, and did not know what to do when Mr. Otis suddenly remembered that, some few days before, he had given a band of gypsies permission to camp in the park. He accordingly at once set off for Blackfell Hollow, where he knew they were accompanied by his eldest son and 2 of the farm servants. The little Duke of Cheshire begged hard to be allowed to go too, but Mr. Otis would not allow him, as he was afraid there might be a fight. On arriving at the spot, however, he found that the gypsies had gone, and it was evident that their departure had been rather sudden, as the fire was still burning and some plates were lying on the grass. Having sent off Washington and the 2 men to search the district, he ran home and sent telegrams to all the police inspectors in the county, telling them to look out for a little girl who had been kidnapped by tramps or gypsies. He then ordered his horse to be brought round, and after insisting on his wife and the 3 boys sitting down to dinner, rode off down the Ascot Road with a stable boy. He had hardly gone a couple of miles, however, when he heard somebody galloping after him. And looking round, saw the little Duke coming up on his pony with his face very red, and no hat. "I'm awfully sorry, Mr. Otis," gasped out the boy. "But I can't eat any dinner as long as Virginia is lost. Please don't be angry with me. If you had let us get engaged last year, there would never have been all this trouble. You won't send me back, will you?" "I can't go. I won't go." The diplomat could not help smiling at the handsome young lad, and was a good deal touched at his devotion to Virginia. So leaning down from his horse, he patted him kindly on the shoulders and said, "Well, Cecil, if you won't go back, I suppose you must come with me. But I must get you a hat at Ascot." "Oh, bother my hat. I want Virginia," cried the little Duke, laughing. And they galloped onto the railway station. There Mr. Otis inquired of the station master if anyone matching the description of Virginia had been seen on the platform, but could get no news of her. The station master, however, telegraphed up and down the line, and assured him that a strict watch would be kept for her. After having bought a hat for the little Duke, Mr. Otis rode off to Bexley, a village about 4 miles away, which he was told was a well-known meeting place of the gypsies, as there was a large meadow next to it. Here they woke the rural policeman, but could get no information from him. And after riding all over the meadow, they turned their horses' heads homewards, and reached the chase about 11 o'clock, dead tired.